Okay. Hi, Sivan. How are you?
Great. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you are an author and the illustrator?
I am. I
Oh,
do both. Yep.
well, now that's kind of unusual because usually people write or they do the illustrations, but not both necessarily. So you've got extra talent, you know?
That or I'm a control freak, one of the other.
Well, listen, it's all right to be a control freak, but if you can have the talent and ability to do it, then absolutely go for it. Yeah. You've written children's books. How many books have you done now?
I've written three children's books with a fourth that will be released in the spring.
Now it says on the top here, a special needs mom. Does that mean that your child is special needs?
So I have one son who is autistic and has ADHD, and I have another son with ADHD, and so they're both neurodiverse. And then I also have ADHD, um, which makes us kind of this neurodiverse family.
What is
My
that?
husband's left out.
What does that mean? What does neurodiverse mean?
So, neurodiversity is this concept that says that people have brain differences. So, there's all kinds of diversity out there. You know, there's racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity, gender diversity. But this is the idea that that people are born with different kinds of thinking styles, and there's a spectrum of different kinds of brains in that bucket. And the one that people know about the most is autism, but ADHD and dyslexia and Tourette syndrome and a bunch of other kinds of different brains fit into that category. And it's an idea that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That it's just a difference. And I think that's an important point because we want people who are neurodiverse to be proud of who they are and to look at the strengths that come with that kind of diversity.
I had this conversation, similar conversation, with somebody who was telling me about dyslexia for that and how people who are dyslexic are not necessarily incapable. In fact, some of them were incredible achievers. There were some very famous people that were dyslexia. So is this the kind of the idea that you're going for, is that it doesn't mean it's a disability to somebody, it just means they think differently than others? Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And so for me, as a parent of neurodiverse kids, it's really important for their self-esteem, for them to feel like, you know what, my brain may think differently or act differently than somebody else's brain, but that doesn't make me less. It just makes me different. And when you step back and you do see lots of creative types or CEOs tend to fit into this neurodiverse category, it gives them something to look forward to say, you know, it is not a disability. I need to learn how to use these differences to my advantage, and then I can build on them.
Are your kids in public school?
They are, and I love our public schools and feel so fortunate that I am able to send my kids to the public school I go to. The kind of support that they get there, that really tailors their education to what they need and structures the environment to allow them to thrive, is something that I can't imagine in my mind a public school would do. But yes, we are in a public school.
Well, I'm happy to hear that because that was my concern as well, is that public schools, particularly ones that are very crowded, tend to be a one-size-fits-all educational curriculum, and that doesn't suit all children. So the idea that they are working to tailor the education for the needs of your kids, I think is good. I think that's real good.
Well, and I think that's kind of our expectation of public school. You know, like they are supposed to teach to all types of kids, and I can't imagine a school that wouldn't put in a handicap ramp for somebody in a wheelchair. Well, the same is true for a child who is neurodiverse and may need a different kind of squishy chair to keep focus in the classroom, or be allowed to wear headphones, right? Like, the accommodations that these schools provide our kids are not disruptive to other kids, right? That the handicap ramp is not a problem for the kids who can take the stairs, but they do provide a level of support for kids with brain differences.
Well, that's a good point. So, what is one of the particular challenges that your kids face as far as the way that they're thinking? Because I'm not having a clear picture in my head of what their day-to-day routine would be. Can you just kind of give me an example of one of the challenges that they might face?
Sure. So it's interesting. All of the books that I've written are true stories based on what happened to my children. And the first book I wrote, and the story that inspired me, was around the Halloween parade when my eldest son was in kindergarten. And in my mind, as a parent, I was so excited. This is Halloween. You know, this is the holiday that every kid loves. You're going to get candy. You get to dress up. And I'm driving him to school the morning of the Halloween parade, and he's in his costume and he refuses to get out of the car. And I couldn't understand. I'm like, why don't you want to go to the Halloween parade? It's going to be so much fun. And he didn't go. He completely was like overwhelmed by it and didn't go. And he was so young that it was hard for him to express what the challenges were. And so over the year, I worked with him and his team at school to figure out what those drivers were that made him so nervous about the Halloween parade. And one of those things was that it was going to be really loud. And so we told him that he could wear headphones on his head during the parade to help with the sensory issues. One of the other challenges was that it changed his school schedule, and lots of kids who are neurodiverse, particularly those who are autistic or ADHD, like schedules because it helps to order their expectations. And again, I don't always talk in generalities like this because it is a spectrum and kids respond differently, but they tend to like schedules. And so we were able to pre-wire him with the schedule of the Halloween parade in order to help him understand the implications of it in advance. And so we took him through a variety of different steps before the Halloween parade. And in first grade, he showed up. He was nervous. He went through all those steps, but at the end, he succeeded. And now he loves the Halloween parade in school. And so it's the kind of thing that if you can step back and put yourself in his shoes to say, what are the kinds of challenges he's going to have? Once I figure that out, then the rest of his day looks like everybody else's day. Until that happened, I couldn't understand where the challenge was.
How does one even determine if your child has this or not? Are there specific tests that they can do?
So I had a hunch as a new mom, and he was my first child, when he was really, really young, probably 18 months old, that something was different about the way his brain worked. He didn't play with toys the same way that other kids played with toys. He had an outrageous vocabulary for somebody that age. When he was 2, his favorite word was crestfallen. He had this incredible ability with numbers and with puzzles. He was doing 100, 200, 300-piece jigsaw puzzles, and he would flip them over and do them without the picture, right? So
Oh, wow.
his ability to look at the world was very different than my ability to look at the world. And I kept taking him to different people to say, what's going on with my kid? And often I got, well, he's just a gifted kid. But I knew in my heart as a mother that that wasn't true. And finally, I was able to get him diagnosed to somebody on the autism spectrum, and was able to then really focus my attention on getting him the support he needed at a young age. So he had speech therapy, and he had OT, and he had work with a whole bunch of other therapists. And I'm in the fortunate position where we were able to go in full force and do all of those things when his mind was still so new and able to kind of shift a lot. And so that's what we did. But my second son was born 2 years later. And if he had been my first son, I would have been able to diagnose my eldest with autism at 3 months. There was such a striking difference between the way he engaged with me and the way that other babies engage.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So how old are they now?
10 and 7. So I have my hands full.
Yeah, I would think so. Did they prescribe any kind of medication for your kids? Are they doing that with autism or ADHD? I mean, I know they did years ago, but I don't know. I haven't really kept up with it. Is there medication that they give?
Sure, that's a great question. So my eldest son never got any medication for autism, and I'm not really on top of the kinds of medications that they would give children. I think in most cases it's around dealing with, you can't give somebody a pill and they're not autistic anymore, right? Like, this is the way their brain is. But there are ways, I think, to deal with stress and anxiety and other things that I've heard some parents give medication to their kids. Both of my kids are on Ritalin for their ADHD, and it was a gut-wrenching decision on my part to give them that medicine, because in my head, I'm like, they're little kids. They're, and I'm giving them a stimulant, which goes totally against your gut as a parent. And they were kind of bouncing off the walls already. And I'm like, I'm giving them a stimulant. What am I doing? But I noticed that their self-esteem was really struggling in school about their ability to focus. And they would come home and feel like they weren't smart, and that other kids could do things that they couldn't do because they were struggling with their focus. And so working with our pediatrician, we tried it, and it was game-changing for them. And so that's what they're on now. My mother is still super mad at me for giving it to them. It is definitely not something that has been easy from a family perspective, but it's not something I regret.
Well, that's the one I've heard of, Ritalin, and I think that one's been around for a while.
It has, since the 30s. Yeah.
And it's supposed to help the kids focus. Is that correct? By giving them, essentially, it's like a large dose of caffeine, where it makes you focus and it makes you a little bit. Did you notice any significant fidgety behavior with them after you gave it to them?
No, in fact, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite?
They couldn't sit still beforehand. It was like, how do I take them to the dining room chair to get them to eat dinner, right? Like, it was such a struggle to get them to sit down. And look, and I have ADHD too, and my husband will joke that I have that same kind of inability to kind of do one thing unless it's something I'm really focused on. But once I gave them the medicine, it actually calmed them down. And the analogy I used with them, because I talked to my kids about their neurodiversity, they know they have ADHD. We talked about the medicine. And there's a doctor who's written a book about ADHD, and he says it's like having a race car brain. And so I told my kids, I'm like, you have a race car brain, which means you can win that race, which is amazing. But you need to learn how to slow down and take those curves, because if you don't, you're going to crash. And the medicine is one of those things that helps you slow down and take the curves so that at the end you can win the race. And with two little boys, they understood that perfectly. And that's kind of the analogy that they use in terms of what's happening to their brains.
Well, it's a great analogy. And it's also kind of ironic that a stimulant would actually calm them down.
It really is. I think when I did the research on it, the story about it was that this doctor was trying everything with this group of boys. And finally, he's like, you know what? Let me just go in the opposite direction. Every time I give them something that's supposed to calm them down, it doesn't. Let me see what happens if I give them the stimulant. And he was completely shocked to see that the stimulant did the very thing he was looking for.
Oh, that's amazing. So your latest book is called Emily D. and the Frightful First Day. And it's, since we talked about, you did the illustrations. So it's kind of a picture book for kids who are afraid to go to school on the first day of school. What
That's
age
right.
group? What age group is this aimed at? As your book's
It's aimed at kids 4 to 7 years old, and it's not specific to a specific grade because, you know, in preschool, kids get very nervous about the first day of school, even if they had been there before. And the illustrations are very specifically focused to neurodiverse kids. So they're intentionally simple. And there isn't a lot in the background to distract them, because oftentimes kids with ADHD, if they're looking at a picture book and the story is talking about this character, but in the background, there may be a bookshelf with a green book on it. So my illustrations are very deliberately simple and clean so that neurodiverse kids will have a much easier time following along with the story and staying on focus.
We do have to wrap this up. We are out of time. Thank you for coming on. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do. It's www.sivan, S-I-V-A-N, Hong, Hong.com. It helps to be the only person in the world with my name, so I was able to get my website.
Oh, that's great. And there's links to your books and social media and
Yes.
everything on there? Okay, super.
Everything's on there.
Well, thanks again for coming on the show.